Chapter 23 Consolidation. Barely 2 months after the encounter with the Al-Nadir Jews, the Prophet learned that the two Arabian tribes of Muharrib and Talaba were mobilizing to attack Medina. Working on the basis that attack is the best defense, the Prophet assembled a force of 700 of his followers and appointed Uthman ibn Affan to deputize for him in Medina. The Muslim force marched a very long way until they reached a place called Nakhl in the area which belonged to the tribes of Ghatafan in the Najd province, right in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. There, the Muslims came face to face with a very large concentration of enemy forces. The two sides drew very close to each other. The Muslims were worried because they realized that they were heavily outnumbered. Despite their numerical strength, their enemies felt very fearful as well. Neither party was keen to attack, and both hoped that a clash could somehow be averted. This was a very hard campaign for the Muslims. They had covered a great distance from Medina, and they had to travel over very hard terrain. The expedition is known in Muslim history books as the Expedition of Cloth Pieces, or Dhat al-Rika. The name is taken from the fact that the Muslims had to wrap their feet in pieces of cloth to relieve the pain as they walked over rocky areas. When the two forces stood face to face, the feeling of fear was common to both of them. It was indeed on this expedition that the Prophet used in his prayers with the Muslims the method known as prayers in the case of fear. This method means that the army is divided into two halves and they take turns as they pray with the Prophet. He himself would pray the whole prayer while one half of his men joined him for the first part of the prayers. Then they would finish their prayers individually. When they had finished, the other half would join the Prophet for the rest of his prayers. Thus, everyone in the army would have joined the same prayers while one half would always be free, watching the enemy and making sure that they did not exploit the time of prayers in order to attack the Muslims. This method of prayer is outlined in verse 102 of Surah 4 entitled Women. For a more detailed description, refer to chapter 26, page 502. No clash, however, took place between the two sides. The Prophet managed to withdraw with his forces intact without engaging the enemy. A great part of the history of Islam at the time of the Prophet is devoted to the military activity of the Muslims. This is natural because those 10 years during which the Prophet established the first Islamic state were full of military operations, owing to the fact that several forces were keen to fight the Muslims and suppress Islam altogether. When relating history, great events overshadow small or ordinary ones. One should not, however, overlook those small events which give a good impression of the type of life the Muslims lived in Medina. From them, one can understand a great deal about how the Muslims treated one another, what sort of relations they had with the Prophet, and how far they were devoted to their cause. In this connection, some events which took place during this expedition are worth mentioning. A friendly conversation. One such incident is related by Jabir ibn Abdullah, a young companion of the Prophet who went on this expedition. He was riding a weak camel, which meant that he kept falling behind. When the Prophet noticed him and learned that the camel was not a strong one, he asked Jabir to set him down. When he did, the Prophet said to him, "Give me the stick in your hand, or cut a stick for me from the tree." The Prophet pricked the side of the camel with the stick several times and asked Jabir to mount the camel. Jabir says, "By him who sent the Prophet with the message of truth, the camel was then as fast as any." The Prophet was then chatting to Jabir and asked him, "Would you sell me this camel of yours, Jabir?" Jabir replied, "It is yours as a gift." The Prophet said, "No, but sell it to me." Jabir said, "Make me an offer then." The Prophet said, "I will give you 1 dirham, the silver currency at the time, for it." Jabir declined the offer and said, "Then you would give me an unfair price." The Prophet said, "What do you say to 2 dirhams?" Jabir declined again. The Prophet kept increasing the price, and Jabir kept declining until the Prophet offered him an ounce of silver. Jabir then said, "Would you be happy to pay this price, Messenger of God?" The Prophet answered in the affirmative, and Jabir accepted the price. The Prophet asked Jabir whether he was married, and Jabir answered that he was. The Prophet then asked him about his wife, and whether she was a virgin getting married for the first time or a woman who had been married before. Jabir's wife was of the latter type. The Prophet said, Would it not have been better if you had married a young virgin with whom you can play and have fun? Jabir, who was perhaps less than 20 years of age at that time, said, Messenger of God, my father was killed at Uhud, leaving me and my 7 sisters to look after. I therefore married a woman who could look after them and keep the family together. The Prophet replied, Then you have done the right thing. God willing, when we arrive at Sirar, we will have some camels slaughtered and we will celebrate. Your wife will then hear that we have celebrated her marriage and she will put her cushions. Putting up cushions was apparently a sign of celebrating a happy occasion. Jabir said, But we have no cushions, Messenger of God. The Prophet said, But you will have. When you arrive at Medina, you should arrange a good feast. When the Muslim army arrived at Sirar, which was only about 5 kilometers from Medina, the Prophet had a number of camels slaughtered and cooked. The whole army shared in the celebration of the recent wedding of one of its soldiers. When the sun went down, the Prophet and his companions went into Medina. Jabir told his wife what the Prophet said, and she advised him to do as the Prophet told him. The following morning, Jabir took his camel and sat him down outside the Prophet's mosque. Then Jabir went into the mosque. When the Prophet came out, he asked about the camel and was told that Jabir had brought it. He asked for Jabir to be called, and when he arrived, the Prophet said, Take your camel, my nephew, it is yours. He then called Bilal, who acted as treasurer, and told him to go with Jabir and to give him an ounce of silver. Bilal did as the Prophet bade him and gave Jabir a fraction more. Jabir said that the camel stayed with him a very long time. This incident shows the degree of care the Prophet used to show to his companions. There are numerous stories about the Prophet doing certain things of a similar nature. These were taken by his companions as signs which consolidated their belief in him as a messenger of God. It is not that they had any doubts, but miraculous acts like his treatment of the camel's weakness tended to confirm for them what they already knew to be true. The fact that the Prophet asked a young companion of his about his family affairs in such a way, as happens between intimate friends, serves to show that the Prophet really cared about every individual among his companions. He was not like a leader who viewed his troops as people whom he could utilize to achieve his personal glory. The Prophet was after no glory for himself, but he wanted to be informed about the affairs of his companions so that they would feel much closer to him. When he realized that Jabir was newly married, he was keen to make the whole community share in the celebration. It is also obvious that the Prophet did not need to buy the camel, but he realized that Jabir was poor, and he knew that he was supporting a family. Buying the camel and giving it as a gift to its previous owner was highly characteristic of the Prophet. He was indeed the best example of generosity. When he asked to buy the camel, he intended all the time to give it back to Jabir as a gift, but he wanted Jabir to name his price so that he felt that the matter was serious. According to one report, the terms of the deal stipulated that Jabir could utilize the camel until they had arrived in Medina. Throughout the journey then, Jabir was convinced that he had sold the camel. But what better wedding gift could he have hoped for than having his camel as well as its price? An assassination attempt. 2 more little incidents that took place during the expedition of Dhat al-Rika are worth mentioning because they shed considerable light on the depth of faith of the Prophet and his companions in their religion. They show how seriously that first generation of Muslims viewed their faith and how literally they took the word of the Quran. A man called Ghorat from the tribe of Muharrib, one of the 2 tribes who were mobilizing to attack Medina, said to his people, "Shall I kill Muhammad for you? Peace be upon him." They replied, "Yes, but how will you do it?" Ghorat said, "I will take him unawares and kill him." He then went to the Prophet and found him sitting alone. He said to him, "Muhammad, peace be upon him, may I look at your sword?" The sword was decorated with silver. The Prophet let him have it, and the man drew it out of its scabbard. He shook the sword repeatedly and tried to hit the Prophet, but every time he did so, he found himself restrained. He then addressed the Prophet, "Muhammad, peace be upon him, do you fear me?" The Prophet answered, "No. Why should I fear you?" The man said, "How can you not fear me when I have the sword in my hand?" The Prophet said, "But I do not fear you." God will protect me from you." The sword dropped to the ground, and the Prophet picked it up and said to Ghorat, "Who will protect you from me?" Ghorat replied, "You can, if you wish, be the best man to overpower any opponent." Ghorat apparently realized that he could save himself only by appealing to the Prophet's generosity. The Prophet then asked him to declare that he believed in God as the only deity and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was his messenger. He said, "I give you my solemn pledge that I will never fight you, and I will never join any people who want to fight you." The Prophet then let him go, and Ghorat went to his people and said, "I have been with the best man on earth." This small incident shows how the Prophet's trust in God was total. God had promised him that he would not come to any harm while he conveyed his message. The Prophet showed on numerous occasions that his confidence in God's promise was both complete and unshakable. Here we see him alone with a man holding a sword in his hand, a man who had come to him for the sole purpose of killing him. Yet he allows him to look at his own sword, and when the man speaks about killing him, the Prophet is in no way perturbed. Uninterrupted prayer. The second incident concerns two of the Prophet's companions, Ammar ibn Yasir of the Muhajirin and Abad ibn Bishr of the Ansar. The Prophet had encamped close to a mountain trail, and he asked for volunteers to keep a night watch. The two men came forward to volunteer for the task, and the Prophet asked them to stay close to the opening of the trail. When they went there, Abad asked his companion whether he preferred to have a nap straight away or stay awake and have his nap later in the night. Ammar preferred to sleep early. When he lay down, his Ansari brother stood up to pray. Apparently, an unbeliever was following the Muslim army. When he drew near, he noticed the figure of the Ansari man saying his prayers. He realized that the man was keeping watch. He aimed an arrow at him and hit him. Abad did not move, but took the arrow off and continued praying. The man hit him with a second arrow, and Abad did the same. A third arrow hit him as he was praying, so he took it off and continued with his prayer, bowing down and then prostrating himself. He then woke his companion and told him that he was wounded. Ammar stood up, and when the man saw the two of them together, he fled. Realizing that Abad was badly wounded, Ammar said to him, "Why did you not wake me up when he hit you the first time?" The Ansari man replied, "I was reading a surah and did not like to cut it short. I hoped to be able to finish it before I did anything. When he hit me 3 times, I bent down and woke you up. I swear that had it not been for the fact that I feared that I would not carry out the Prophet's order to keep watch in the way I should, I would not have cut the surah short, even if he had slit my throat." As it is well known, there is nothing wrong with reading only a portion of the surah in prayers, be it a short or a long portion. Prayers are valid even if one reads only one verse of a very long surah. Yet the man realized that every surah of the Quran is a complete unit. Keeping that in mind, he was keen to read the whole surah in one session, whether he was praying or not. Since God made the division of the Quran into surahs, the Ansari man wanted to keep strictly to that division. When he found that in that particular instance, reading the whole surah might have put the Muslims in danger, he cut his prayers short and did his duty. This is just one example of the devotion of the Prophet's companions to their cause. This expedition was highly beneficial to the Muslims, despite the fact that no encounter with the unbelievers took place. The mere fact that the Muslims were ready to march a considerable distance in order to meet their enemies before they could attack them in Medina was an indication of unshaken self-confidence. The fact that the unbelievers did not manage to engage the Muslims in a battle, despite the fact that theirs was a much larger force, showed that the Muslims were truly feared by their enemies. Coming so soon after the second encounter with the Jews, which resulted in an evacuation of a strong Jewish tribe from Medina without shedding a drop of blood, this expedition gave a new boost to the Muslims' morale, which went a long way to wipe out the effects of their defeat at Uhud. It meant that the external enemy was unsure of its strength, worried that the Muslims could not be overcome. Turning up for a new clash. The Prophet stayed in Medina for about 3 months after this expedition and then called on the Muslims to get ready for their appointment with the Quraysh. At the end of the Battle of Uhud, Abu Sufyan had suggested that the two sides meet again in 1 year's time at Badr. That eventful year was now coming to its conclusion, and the appointed time was drawing near. The Muslims were therefore getting ready, cherishing the hope that this time they would inflict on the Quraysh a heavy defeat, which would destroy their reputation as the major tribe in Arabia. In Mecca, Abu Sufyan did not look forward to the approaching appointment. He would have preferred to continue to capitalize on the victory he achieved at Uhud in order to preserve the Quraysh's reputation. He realized that a new battle might change the whole situation. Besides, that year brought a prolonged drought in Mecca, which adversely affected its resources. If one adds to this fact that the Muslims in Medina continued to impose a trade boycott on the Quraysh, not allowing their caravans to go through towards Syria, one can realize that the Quraysh suffered an economic crisis that year. Abu Sufyan, however, could not just miss out on the appointment. That would have been an unmistakable sign of weakness, which he was unwilling to give. He therefore resorted to trickery, hoping that he would be able to frighten the Muslims off going out to meet the Quraysh. He hired a man called Nuaym ibn Masud and asked him to spread rumors in Medina that the Quraysh had raised a very large force to fight the Muslims and that the Muslims were no match for that force. Nuaym did as he was instructed and spread that rumor as far as he could. The Prophet, however, was determined to keep the appointment. He said, "By him who holds my soul in his hand, I am going out to meet them even if no one joins me." The Muslims, however, were very keen to join the Prophet, and he marched at the head of 1,500 of his followers. He appointed as his deputy in Medina Abdullah ibn Ubay, the son of the hypocrites' leader. Unlike his father, Abdullah was a man of sincere and strong faith. When they arrived at Badr, which was about 160 kilometers from Medina, they found no trace of the enemy. What happened was that an army from the Quraysh marched from Mecca towards Badr. Abu Sufyan was very uneasy about meeting the Muslims. He was convinced that the time was not suitable for the Quraysh. He addressed his soldiers, pointing out the difficulties they had experienced that year, and said that they could not hope to win a war in such a year of drought. They had to wait for a good season when there would be an abundance of crops and dairy products. He advised the army to return, and they took his advice. Although Abu Sufyan's action might have been prudent in the circumstances, it did not help the Quraysh's cause in any way. In fact, it helped the cause of the Muslims. Even the people of Mecca itself accused the army of cowardice. The fact that they went back after they had started to march was unjustifiable to many of the Arabs who started to doubt the significance of the Quraysh's victory at Uhud. Badr was a seasonal market of Arabia. People from all tribes assembled there during the month of Shaban and exchanged goods and commodities. The trading fair lasted for 8 days. The Prophet and his companions benefited a great deal from being at Badr at that time. Their financial gains from the market were considerable. Their more important gain was the recovery of their reputation as a strong fighting force equal to any in Arabia. These events and expeditions of Al-Nadir, Dhat al-Rika, and the final expedition to Badr, close on each other's heels, were of great psychological significance to the Muslims. They made the defeat at Uhud seem to be an event in the ancient past, despite the fact that it had taken place only a year earlier. When the market was over, the Muslims returned to Medina, having demonstrated that they feared no one in Arabia. A new marriage. Shortly after the return to Medina, the Prophet married Salama, whose name was Hind. The title of Salama was given to her according to the traditions of Arabia, which are still valid in many Arab countries. The word means mother, and Salama was the name of her eldest son. To call any person, man or woman, by the fact of their parenthood of their eldest son is a sign of respect. Salama was so much better known by her title that few books record her original name. Apparently, Salama was middle-aged. This is evident from the fact that her own son, Salama, acted for her when the marriage contract was made. However, she was good-looking and belonged to a distinguished family. Her husband, Abu Salama, was one of the first companions of the Prophet to emigrate with his wife first to Abyssinia and then to Medina. He was certainly a good soldier of Islam and a good military commander. He received a wound at the Battle of Uhud when he remained steadfast with the Prophet while many others of his companions were overtaken by confusion. Although his wound healed and he was well enough to be the commander of another expedition where he fought against the tribe of Asad, he suffered a recurrence of his injury which led to his death. When the Prophet sent someone over a year later to propose to her on his behalf, Salama was overjoyed. To be married to the Prophet was an honor no Muslim woman would hesitate to accept. Yet, she was worried lest she should not be able to fulfill her duties as the wife of God's messenger. After all, she was no longer young. She had children, some of whom were still young, and the Prophet had other wives. She therefore sent a kind apology. "I cannot help my jealousy. I am old and burdened with young dependents." The Prophet, however, answered, "If you are old, I am older than you. God will relieve you of your jealousy. You may commend your dependence to God and His Messenger." Salama was either the third or fourth wife of the Prophet in Medina. He was already married to Sauda, who was an elderly woman, Aisha, who was in the prime of youth, and possibly Hafsa, who was of mature age. Another expedition. The fact that the Quraysh did not wish to engage the Muslims in a new battle meant that the initiative was now completely in the Muslims' hands. The Prophet was eager that the Muslim state in Medina should not be considered an easy target by any prospective enemy. His informers brought him intelligence that the Arab tribes in the area of Dumat al-Jandal in the north of Arabia, close to Palestine and Syria, had been attacking trade caravans and threatening all travelers. Their exploits had convinced them that they were too powerful for anyone, so much so that they contemplated attacking Medina. Moreover, he was told that a large force had been raised to launch such an attack. The Prophet therefore raised a force of 1,000 men of his companions and marched northwards with them. They marched at night and encamped during the day so that they could take their enemy by surprise. It was a long journey, taking 15 nights to cover the distance. An expert guide was employed to show them the way. The Muslims the majority of them were hypocrites. When the Prophet came back, they went to him and gave various reasons for staying behind, asking him to pardon them. The Prophet granted their request, but God has made it clear in the Quran that they have not been pardoned by him. 3 people had a different case altogether. Here is their story, as related by one of them, Ka'b ibn Malik. No false excuses. I have never stayed behind when the Prophet went on any expedition, except that of Badr. Neither God nor the Prophet blamed anyone for staying behind at the time of Badr, because the Prophet set out from Medina to intercept a trade caravan which belonged to the Quraysh. The battle took place without any preparation or prior planning. On the other hand, I had attended the pledge of the Ansar to the Prophet at Aqaba when we made our commitment to Islam absolutely clear. I would not exchange my attendance there with taking part in the Battle of Badr, although Badr is the more famous occasion. Nevertheless, I failed to join the army of the expedition of Tabuk. I was never in better circumstances or more physically able than I was then. At no time did I have 2 means of transport except on that occasion. It was the habit of the Prophet to keep his destination secret. This time, however, setting his destination so far away and moving in an exceptionally hot climate, he made it clear to the people that he intended to attack the Byzantines. Those who joined the Prophet were in such large numbers that no register of them could have been kept. In the circumstances, anyone who wished to stay behind might have thought that he would not be noticed unless God chose to inform the Prophet about him by revelation. The Prophet decided to launch that attack at a time when fruits were abundant and people preferred to stay in the shade. The Prophet and the Muslims, however, were busy getting ready for their impending task. I went out day after day to the marketplace in order to get my equipment, but I always came back having done nothing. I always thought that I was able to get whatever I needed in no time. Nevertheless, I continued in that condition until it was time to move. The Prophet and the army with him started their march, and I had not got my preparations underway. I thought to myself, I can still get myself ready in a day or 2 and should be able to catch up with them. When they had covered quite a distance, I went out to the market and came back having done nothing. This continued day after day. By this time, the army must have covered quite a long distance. I thought I must make a move now and catch up with them. I wish I had done that, but I did not. Every time I went out after the Prophet and the army had left, I was troubled by the fact that I saw only people who were known to be hypocrites or people who were physically unable to join the army. My place was not with either group. I was told that the Prophet did not mention me until he had arrived at Tabuk. He remarked once to those who were present at Tabuk, "What has happened to Ka'b ibn Malik?" A man from the tribe of Salama said to him, "Messenger of God, his wealth and arrogance made him stay behind." Mu'adh ibn Jabal said to him, "What a foul remark, Messenger of God, we have known nothing bad of the man." The Prophet made no comment. I soon heard that the Prophet and his companions had started their journey back from Tabuk. I felt very sad. To tell a lie was paramount in my mind. He tried to make a false case for himself. His faith made him fully aware that he could not tell the Prophet a lie, yet the Prophet did not pray to God for his forgiveness. His sincerity and honest reply did not merit him more than an acknowledgement of his truthfulness by the Prophet. Judgment was left to God. It was not an easy position for him, nor was his attitude appreciated by all people. Some people might have thought that had he given any excuse, the Prophet would have prayed to God to forgive him, and that would have been sufficient. Indeed, some members of his clan came to him and said, "We have never known you to commit a sin before this. You could have certainly given the Prophet an excuse like all those who stayed behind. You would have been spared this trouble had the Prophet prayed to God to forgive you, as he would surely have done." Harder times ahead. Ka'b says, "They continued pressing me on this to the extent that I wished to go back to the Prophet and tell him that I was lying. Before I did that, however, I asked whether anyone else said the same thing as I did. They answered that 2 more people said the same and were given the same answer. When I asked their names, they mentioned Murara ibn